Hey everyone. Before we dive into tonight's investigation, if you're enjoying the content and want to help the channel grow, please consider hitting that like button and subscribing. It genuinely helps more than you could possibly know and makes a massive difference in getting these stories out to more people. Also, if you're up for it, drop a comment letting us know what time it is where you are and where in the world you're listening from. We absolutely love seeing where everyone is tuning in from, whether you're winding down for the night or just starting your day. No pressure though, only if you want to share. Alright, let's get into tonight's investigation. What if I told you that the year isn't really 2026? What if, instead, we're living in the year 1729? What if nearly 3 centuries of human history, the entire medieval period as we know it, never actually happened? What if Charlemagne never existed, the Vikings never raided, and the construction of Europe's great cathedrals is a fabrication designed to hide a massive chronological fraud? This isn't just wild speculation. It's a theory that's been gaining traction in certain academic circles since the 1990s, supported by archaeological anomalies, astronomical inconsistencies, and documentary evidence that suggests someone, at some point in history, added approximately 297 years to our calendar that never actually occurred. Welcome to the Phantom Time Hypothesis, one of the most unsettling conspiracy theories you've never heard of. Because if it's true, then everything we think we know about the medieval period, about the foundation of modern Europe, about the development of Western civilization itself, might be an elaborate lie constructed by powerful figures who had everything to gain from rewriting history. The story begins in 1991 with a German historian named Heribert Illig. Unlike most conspiracy theorists, Illig wasn't a fringe figure with no credentials. He had a doctorate in historical studies and had spent decades examining inconsistencies in the archaeological and documentary record of the early Middle Ages. What he discovered would challenge everything mainstream historians believed about European history. Illig's thesis was simple but staggering. The period from approximately AD 614 to AD 911 never happened. Nearly 3 centuries of history, he argued, had been fabricated by a conspiracy involving the Holy Roman Emperor Otto III, Pope Sylvester II, and possibly the Byzantine Emperor Constantine VII. These powerful figures, according to Illig, wanted to position themselves at the significant millennium year of AD 1000, so they simply inserted 297 phantom years into the historical record. The implications are mind-boggling. If Illig is correct, then we're not living in 2026, we're living in 1729. Charlemagne, one of the most important figures in European history, never existed. The Carolingian Renaissance was a fabrication. The Viking Age, as we understand it, never happened. Entire dynasties, battles, cultural achievements, and historical figures that we've been taught about since elementary school were invented wholesale by medieval propagandists. But Illig didn't arrive at this conclusion lightly. He spent years accumulating evidence, finding anomaly after anomaly in the historical record that suggested something was profoundly wrong with our understanding of the early medieval period. The foundation of Illig's theory rests on a deceptively simple observation. The calendar doesn't add up. In 1582, Pope Gregory XIII introduced the Gregorian calendar to replace the Julian calendar that had been in use since 45 BC. The Julian calendar had a slight mathematical error. It calculated the solar year as 365.25 days, when it's actually 365.2422 days. That difference of about 11 minutes per year doesn't seem like much, but over centuries, those minutes add up. By the time Pope Gregory made his reform, the calendar had drifted 10 days out of sync with the actual solar year. To correct this, Gregory simply eliminated 10 days from the calendar. October 4th, 1582, was followed immediately by October 15th, 1582. 10 days just disappeared. But here's where it gets strange. If the Julian calendar had been in use since 45 BC, and if it loses about a day every 128 years due to that mathematical error, then by 1582, a span of 1,627 years, the calendar should have been off by approximately 13 days, not just 10. The 3 missing days represent about 384 years of accumulated error. But Pope Gregory only corrected for 10 days of drift. Where did those extra 3 days go? Or more precisely, where did those 384 years go? Illig's answer is, they never existed. The calendar calculation was actually correct for the amount of time that had genuinely passed since Julius Caesar. But by 1582, the official historical record claimed that more time had passed than actually had. Someone, at some point, had inserted phantom centuries into the chronology. Now, mainstream historians have responded to this by pointing out that the calculation is more complex than Illig suggests, involving leap year adjustments and other factors. But Illig countered that these explanations were retrofitted to explain away an anomaly that suggested a far more disturbing truth. Our entire understanding of medieval chronology is built on a fabrication. If nearly 3 centuries of history were fabricated, then the most significant casualty would be Charlemagne, Charles the Great, King of the Franks, Emperor of the Romans, the man credited with unifying much of Western Europe and laying the foundation for medieval European civilization. According to traditional history, Charlemagne lived from 742 to 814 AD, right in the middle of the phantom time period that Illig claims never existed. He conquered vast territories, promoted education and the arts during the Carolingian Renaissance, and was crowned emperor by Pope Leo III on Christmas Day in the year 800. He's one of the most documented figures of the early Middle Ages, with contemporary chronicles, legal documents, architectural projects, and even physical artifacts attributed to his reign. But Illig argues that when you examine the evidence closely, Charlemagne starts to look less like a real historical figure and more like a literary creation, a composite character designed to provide legitimacy to later medieval rulers who needed an impressive pedigree. First, there's the problem of documentation. The primary sources for Charlemagne's life were written decades or even centuries after his supposed death. The most famous biography, Einhard's Life of Charlemagne, was written around 830 AD, allegedly just 16 years after Charlemagne's death. But Illig points out that the text contains anachronisms and stylistic elements that suggest it was actually written much later and backdated to appear contemporary. Moreover, Einhard's biography is suspiciously similar to the ancient Roman biography, Life of Augustus by Suetonius. The structure, the narrative beats, even specific phrases are nearly identical. It's as if someone in the later medieval period took a Roman biography and simply inserted a medieval king into the template, creating a plausible-sounding but entirely fictional account. Second, there's the archaeological problem. Charlemagne supposedly built magnificent palaces, churches and monasteries throughout his empire. His palace at Aachen was said to be one of the architectural marvels of its age. But when archaeologists have attempted to verify the dating of these structures through scientific methods like radiocarbon dating and dendrochronology, the results are often inconsistent with the traditional chronology. Buildings attributed to the Carolingian period frequently date to either significantly earlier or significantly later periods. The architectural styles don't match what we would expect from the 8th and 9th centuries, and in many cases, the documentary evidence for these buildings' construction dates comes from sources that were written centuries after the fact, potentially as part of the fabrication. Third, there's the numismatic evidence, or rather, the lack of it. Charlemagne supposedly reformed the monetary system throughout his empire, introducing new coinage that would have been widely distributed and used. But the actual physical evidence of Carolingian-era coins is remarkably sparse. The coins that do exist often have questionable provenance, and when subjected to metallurgical analysis, their composition sometimes doesn't match what we would expect from 8th century minting techniques. But perhaps the most damning evidence against Charlemagne's existence is the lack of contemporary non-Frankish sources. If a figure as important as Charlemagne had really unified much of Western Europe and been crowned emperor, we would expect contemporary chroniclers in other parts of Europe and the Mediterranean to have mentioned him. Byzantine historians should have written about this new emperor in the West. Arab chroniclers, who were meticulous in documenting events across the known world, should have recorded his campaigns. But the contemporary mentions are suspiciously sparse or non-existent. The few that do exist often come from manuscripts that were discovered during later medieval periods, raising questions about whether they were genuine contemporary accounts or later fabrications designed to provide evidence for a manufactured history. Illig's conclusion is, Charlemagne was invented during the 10th century as a legendary ancestor figure who could provide legitimacy to the Ottonian dynasty of Holy Roman Emperors. By creating a glorious predecessor, Otto III and his collaborators could claim they were restoring a great empire rather than building something new. Otto III and Sylvester II would manipulate the calendar in the West, inserting phantom centuries and creating false documentation to support the new chronology. Constantine VII would ensure that Byzantine chronicles were aligned with the Western version, or at least wouldn't contradict it. Monasteries throughout Europe would receive instructions to produce backdated documents, chronicles, charters, saints' lives, legal codes, all describing events that never happened during centuries that never occurred. The result would be a consistent historical narrative spanning 3 phantom centuries, supported by documentary evidence produced across the Christian world. Future generations would never question the chronology because all the sources would agree. The fraud would be complete and permanent. As Illig developed his theory, he accumulated additional evidence that seemed to support the phantom time hypothesis. Each piece, taken individually, might be explained away, but the cumulative weight of anomalies suggested that something was seriously wrong with the traditional medieval chronology. Gothic architecture supposedly developed gradually over centuries during the High Middle Ages, with each generation of builders learning from their predecessors and slowly perfecting the techniques that would create the soaring cathedrals of the 13th and 14th centuries. But when you examine the actual buildings, a strange pattern emerges. There's a distinct gap in architectural development between the Romanesque style of the late 10th and early 11th centuries and the Gothic style that supposedly emerged in the mid-12th century. The technical sophistication required for Gothic construction, the flying buttresses, the pointed arches, the ribbed vaults, represents such a dramatic leap forward that it's difficult to explain how it could have occurred through gradual evolution. It's as if builders went to sleep building simple Romanesque churches and woke up a few decades later with the knowledge to construct Notre Dame de Paris. The intervening centuries of supposed architectural development are poorly documented, and many of the buildings allegedly from this transitional period have dating problems when subjected to scientific analysis. Illig's explanation is, Gothic architecture didn't develop over centuries. It emerged relatively quickly when you remove the phantom time from the equation. The supposed Romanesque buildings of the early 11th century and the Gothic masterpieces of the late 12th century might actually be separated by only a few decades of real time, making the technological leap much more plausible. Medieval manuscripts are one of our primary sources for understanding the period, but they present numerous problems for the traditional chronology. First, there's the curious fact that very few manuscripts survive from the phantom time period. We have manuscripts from before 614 AD and plenty from after 911 AD, but the 3 intervening centuries produced remarkably little. Mainstream historians explain this as the result of the Dark Ages, a period of cultural collapse following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, when literacy declined and manuscript production slowed. But Illig asks if this period really happened, where are all the manuscripts? Even in the darkest ages, some books should have survived. The near-complete absence of manuscripts from this period suggests that the period itself might not have existed. Moreover, the manuscripts we do have from the supposed Carolingian Renaissance show suspicious characteristics. They're often discovered in later medieval periods, conveniently providing evidence for events and figures from the phantom centuries. When subjected to modern forensic analysis, their dating is frequently ambiguous or contradictory. Ancient and medieval astronomers kept detailed records of celestial events, eclipses, comets, planetary conjunctions. These records can be checked against modern astronomical calculations to verify their accuracy and dating. If the phantom time hypothesis is correct, we should find discrepancies between the dates given for celestial events in medieval sources and the actual dates when those events occurred according to astronomical calculation. and we do find exactly these discrepancies. Medieval chronicles frequently describe eclipses and other astronomical events with dates that don't correspond to when those events actually happened. Mainstream historians explain these as errors in observation or recording, but the errors are often in the direction of making events appear to have occurred during the phantom time period. One particularly striking example involves Halley's Comet, which has a predictable 76-year orbital period. Ancient sources document its appearances with great regularity before 614 AD, and medieval sources document it reliably after 911 AD. But during the phantom time period, references to Halley's Comet are confused, contradictory, or missing entirely. Exactly what we would expect if chroniclers were trying to fabricate astronomical observations for centuries that never occurred. The phantom time hypothesis didn't go unnoticed by mainstream historians. When Illig first published his theory in the early 1990s, it triggered a fierce debate that continues to this day. The academic establishment largely rejected his claims, but they couldn't ignore the questions he raised about medieval chronology. The most common counter-argument is that too many independent sources confirm the traditional chronology for it all to be fabricated. We have Islamic chronicles that mention European events during the phantom time period. We have archaeological evidence from excavations throughout Europe. We have dendrochronological data, tree ring dating, that seems to confirm the traditional dates. But Illig and his supporters have responses to each of these objections. Islamic chronicles that mention European events from the Phantom period are often from later compilations rather than contemporary sources, and they could have been influenced by the same fabricated Western chronology they're supposed to independently confirm. Archaeological dating has larger margins of error than most people realise, and the dates are often calibrated against the very historical chronology they're supposed to verify. Dendrochronological data requires reference sequences that extend back continuously, and these sequences themselves depend on historically dated wood samples, creating potential circularity in the dating. But the most powerful argument against the phantom time hypothesis isn't scientific, it's practical. Mainstream historians argue that such a massive fraud would have been impossible to coordinate. Too many people would need to be involved. Chroniclers throughout Europe and Byzantium, monks copying manuscripts in hundreds of monasteries, government officials producing legal documents, architects and builders creating structures with false provenance. Surely, the argument goes, someone would have revealed the conspiracy. Surely some document would have survived that exposed the fraud. Surely the sheer logistical complexity of fabricating 3 centuries of history would have made the scheme impossible. Illig's response is that medieval power structures made exactly this kind of coordination possible. The church controlled literacy and document production throughout Europe. Monasteries operated under strict hierarchical control, with orders from Rome or Constantinople being followed without question. The vast majority of the population was illiterate and relied entirely on church and state authorities for their understanding of history and chronology. If the Pope and the Emperor declared that the year was 1000 AD and ordered the production of documents supporting that chronology, who would dare contradict them? Any monk who questioned the new timeline could be accused of heresy. Any chronicler who refused to produce backdated documents could be removed from his position. The conspiracy wouldn't require everyone to know about it, just the people at the top of the power structure who could issue orders that would be followed without question by those below. Moreover, Illig argues, the fraud was only possible because it was introduced at a specific historical moment, the actual turn of the millennium, according to the real chronology. By positioning the fraud at such a symbolically significant time, the conspirators could leverage religious belief and millennium fever to make people accept the new chronology. And once a generation or two had passed with everyone believing the new dates, the fraud would become self-perpetuating. Future generations would never question it, because they would have no frame of reference for the real chronology. One of the strongest pieces of evidence for the phantom time hypothesis is the Dark Ages themselves, or rather, how strangely dark they were. According to traditional history, the period following the fall of the Western Roman Empire, 476 AD, saw a dramatic collapse of civilization in Western Europe. Cities were abandoned, literacy declined, trade networks broke down, and cultural achievements ground to a halt. For centuries, Europe supposedly languished in ignorance and poverty, only beginning to recover during the Carolingian Renaissance of the late 8th and early 9th centuries. But the Dark Ages narrative has always been problematic. The collapse seems too complete, too uniform across different regions that should have had very different experiences. Archaeological evidence shows that many Roman cities didn't actually collapse. They just transformed gradually into medieval towns. Trade continued, albeit at reduced levels, and some regions, particularly in Italy and Spain, maintained relatively high levels of literacy and cultural sophistication throughout the supposed Dark Ages. The traditional chronology requires us to believe that civilization collapsed dramatically around 500 AD, stayed collapsed for nearly 3 centuries, then suddenly began recovering in the 8th century with the Carolingian Renaissance. But when you actually look at the archaeological evidence, without the preconception that these centuries existed, a different pattern emerges. The evidence suggests a much shorter period of disruption following Rome's fall, perhaps only a few decades of crisis before stabilization and recovery began. What we call the Dark Ages might actually be the result of the phantom time insertion, a way of explaining why there's such a dramatic gap in the documentary and archaeological record, because those centuries never happened and the gap is artificial. When you remove the phantom centuries from the equation, the transition from late antiquity to the high Middle Ages becomes much more comprehensible. Instead of a mysterious 3-century collapse, followed by an equally mysterious renaissance, you get a more typical pattern of crisis, adjustment, and recovery occurring over a much shorter time frame. This would also explain why the Carolingian Renaissance seems to come out of nowhere. Traditional historians struggle to explain how a civilization that had supposedly been barely literate for centuries suddenly produced a flowering of learning and culture. But if the phantom time is removed, the Carolingian Renaissance wasn't a renaissance at all. It was the normal continuation of late antique culture after a brief period of disruption, not a miraculous recovery after 3 dark centuries. While Western European history during the Phantom time period is suspiciously sparse and contradictory, Byzantine history from the same era is unusually well documented, almost too well documented. The Byzantine Empire supposedly produced detailed chronicles, maintained sophisticated administrative records, and preserved a continuous cultural tradition throughout the Dark Ages when Western Europe was foundering. But when you examine Byzantine sources carefully, curious patterns emerge. Many of the most important Byzantine chronicles covering the Phantom time period were compiled during or after the reign of Constantine VII Porphyrogenitus, ruled 913 to 959 AD. The very Emperor Illig identifies as a potential co-conspirator. Constantine's historical projects involved systematically collecting, organising, and critics argue, creating or altering historical documents to support the legitimacy of his dynasty and the empire. Moreover, Byzantine historians during Constantine's reign and afterward show suspicious knowledge of Western European events from the Phantom period, knowledge that supposedly came from Western sources that may themselves have been fabricated. It's a circular chain of evidence. Western chronicles cite Byzantine sources, which in turn cite Western sources, with no independent verification that any of it actually happened. The relationship between Byzantium and the West during the supposed Phantom centuries also raises questions. According to traditional history, the two regions had extensive diplomatic, commercial, and cultural contacts. But the archaeological evidence for these contacts is surprisingly thin. Trade goods that should have moved between East and West during this period are notably scarce. Diplomatic agreements supposedly made during this time often survive only in later copies of questionable provenance. Illig suggests that Byzantine cooperation was essential to the Phantom time fraud. If Byzantine chronicles had contradicted the Western chronology, the conspiracy would have been exposed. But with Byzantine sources aligned with, or created to align with, the Western timeline, the fabrication could achieve the appearance of independent verification that would make it believable for future generations. One of the strongest arguments against the phantom time hypothesis comes from Islamic history. The Islamic calendar is independent of the Christian calendar, based on a different starting point, the Hijra, Muhammad's migration from Mecca to Medina in 622 AD, and a different calculation method, lunar rather than solar years. If Christian Europe had fabricated 3 centuries of history, Islamic chroniclers, who were meticulous in their record-keeping, should have noticed the discrepancy. Islamic historians from the medieval period do describe interactions with European powers during the Phantom Time period. Arab chronicles mention conflicts with the Franks, trade with Byzantine merchants, and diplomatic exchanges with various European rulers. Surely these independent Islamic sources prove that the Phantom Centuries really existed? Not necessarily, Illig and his supporters argue. First, many of the Islamic sources that supposedly confirm European events from the Phantom period were compiled significantly after the fact, sometimes centuries later. These later compilations could have been influenced by the already established European chronology, or they could have been deliberately altered to align with it through a conspiracy that extended beyond Christian Europe. Second, the Islamic calendar's independence from the Christian calendar doesn't mean Islamic historians were immune to Christian chronological influence. Trade, diplomacy, and cultural exchange meant that Islamic scholars were constantly interfacing with Christian Europe's dating systems. If the Christian chronology was universally accepted by everyone they interacted with, Islamic historians might simply have incorporated it into their own historical framework without questioning its accuracy. Third, and most disturbingly, Illig raises the possibility that the conspiracy extended beyond Christian Europe into the Islamic world. If the phantom time fraud was coordinated at the highest levels of Christian power, might Islamic rulers have been approached as potential collaborators, or at least persuaded to cooperate with the new chronology? Consider the political situation in the 10th century. The Islamic world was fragmented into competing caliphates and dynasties. The Abbasid Caliphate, which had once dominated the Islamic world, was in decline. Regional powers were rising, each seeking legitimacy and recognition. If Christian rulers offered diplomatic recognition, trade agreements, or military alliances in exchange for Islamic cooperation with a chronological fraud, some Islamic leaders might have agreed. Moreover, the Islamic world had its own reasons for wanting to position themselves at significant calendar dates. The Islamic year 400 AH, 1009 to 1010 AD, in the traditional chronology, held symbolic importance as the beginning of a new Islamic century. If Islamic rulers could coordinate with Christian Europe to ensure both civilizations were at symbolically significant dates simultaneously, it might serve everyone's political interests. The evidence for Islamic involvement in the conspiracy is circumstantial at best, but the fact that Islamic sources generally don't contradict the European chronology, and in fact often seem to confirm it, is less powerful evidence against the phantom time hypothesis than mainstream historians claim. The independence of Islamic sources is only meaningful if we can be certain those sources weren't influenced by or coordinated with the European chronology they're supposed to verify. Perhaps the most contentious aspect of the phantom time debate involves archaeological evidence. Mainstream historians argue that physical evidence from excavations throughout Europe confirms the traditional chronology. Cities, fortifications, churches, and everyday artifacts from the Phantom period have been discovered and dated, proving that people were living, building, and creating during those supposedly fabricated centuries. But Illig and his supporters point to significant problems with the archaeological evidence that suggest things aren't as straightforward as the mainstream narrative claims. First, there's the issue of stratigraphic gaps. Stratigraphy is the study of layers in archaeological sites, with deeper layers generally being older. If the Phantom time period really existed as 3 continuous centuries of occupation and activity, we should find clear stratigraphic evidence, 300 years' worth of accumulated deposits, with artifacts and structures showing gradual evolution over time. But what archaeologists actually find in many early medieval sites are curious gaps. Layers that should represent the Phantom centuries are often missing, compressed, or discontinuous. Sites that were supposedly occupied throughout this period show evidence of abandonment or minimal activity when the physical evidence is examined without the preconception that the traditional chronology must be correct. Mainstream archaeologists explain these gaps as the result of the Dark Ages, periods when sites were abandoned or activity decreased dramatically. But Innig argues that this is circular reasoning. The gaps exist because the phantom time never occurred, and archaeologists interpret the gaps as evidence of the Dark Ages because they're committed to maintaining the traditional chronology. Second, there's the radiocarbon dating problem. Radiocarbon dating is supposed to provide independent verification of archaeological chronology, measuring the decay of carbon-14 in organic materials to determine their age. But radiocarbon dating has significant margins of error, especially for medieval periods, and the technique requires calibration against known historical dates. This hypothesis makes us question everything we know about medieval history, but perhaps its real value is in teaching us to question everything we think we know, period. 3 centuries of history that might never have happened, fabricated by a conspiracy of medieval power brokers and accepted without question for more than a millennium. Is it true? I can't tell you definitively. If you found this video thought-provoking, hit that like button and subscribe to the channel. Drop a comment letting me know what you think, and most importantly, suggest topics for future episodes. Until next time.